Do I look ridiculous? Yes. Do I feel cute though? Also yes. I am going to take these glasses off though because they are broken and they're holding on by a thread. But anyways, my name is Cryptickitten, and on my channel we like to talk about the magical, the mythical, and the macabre in folklore, mythology, and the media. And Mothman is one of my favorite cryptids. The Mothman has to be one of the most beloved cryptids to exist and is so mysterious that its elusiveness intrigues people to this day. When I learned that the Mothman was in Fallout 76, I was genuinely so excited, and to hear that multiple cryptids are represented in 76 tickled my fancy to the highest degree. But before we talk about the Mothman in 76, let's start with how the Mothman legend began. In November 1966, two gravediggers were doing what they do best, digging in a grave in a cemetery. They later would describe a strange, black, man-like figure flying over their heads. And this could possibly be the very first sighting of the Mothman ever. Not long after, on November 15, 1966, residents of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Millette were a set of young couples who were on a drive together when they saw on the side of the road something that absolutely terrified them. Near the site of a World War II ammunition plant called the TNT area by locals was a large, black, humanoid creature with eyes that glowed red. Linda would later describe it as a slender, muscular man about 7 foot tall, and that's freaking tall. Once the couples gazed their eyes on this creature, they sped away, going at least 90 to 100 miles per hour, thinking they'd leave it in the dust. However, the creature spread its large wings and chased after them with a horrifying screech and followed them as far as the city limits, which I would have absolutely shit my pants. The next day, on November 16, 1966, the famous newspaper article would be published titled "Couple See Man-Sized Bird, Creature, Something." This terrified residents and the townspeople would go out with weapons to hunt down this creature, but with no luck. However, over time, more and more sightings would be reported. A few of the sightings include two volunteer firemen stating that it was a large bird with red eyes, and a contractor named Newell Partridge told Mason County Sheriff George Johnson that he aimed a flashlight at a weird creature he saw and his eyes glowed like bicycle reflectors. He then went to blame the buzzing on his TV to the creature, which I doubt. Sometimes technology just kind of sucks. But he also blamed the disappearance of his German Shepherd on the Mothman. And this is the only account I've seen of the Mothman stealing animals from people, but it's gotta eat somehow, I guess. That's only a very few, because according to American folklorist Jan Harold Brandvind, at least 100 people claim to have seen the Mothman, with many more afraid to report their sightings. And you might be wondering why so many people describe the Mothman as a bird rather than the moth, and I wonder that too. So how did the Mothman name come to be? The answer is that Batman was very popular as a TV show and comic, and Batman had a villain called the Killer Moth. And possibly because the Killer Moth reminded a news reporter about the ominous creature of Point Pleasant, the Mothman officially came to life. With a creature like the Mothman, of course, just like any paranormal phenomenon, there were many people skeptical of the Mothman's existence. Mason County Sheriff George Johnson, whom I mentioned earlier, believed that what people were seeing was an unusually sized heron he called a shitpoke, which I thought was a weird nickname at first, but according to Wikipedia, it's a reference to birds that poop when they're scared. Very relatable.
Which I would have absolutely shit my pants.
To solidify this sentiment, wildlife biologist Robert L. Smith at West Virginia University says that the description of the Mothman closely resembled the sandhill crane. The sandhill crane is a large North American bird that stands 3.2 to 3.9 feet or 1 to 1.2 meters tall, with a wingspan that is 5.9 to 6.5 feet or 1.8 to 2 meters long. It also has a distinct reddish coloring around its eyes. The crane may somehow have left its migration route, and because people in the area have never seen it before, it could have been very confusing seeing this fairly big bird out and about. The sandhill crane is named after the sandhill near Platte River in Nebraska. Every spring, they migrate across North America, stopping in states like Nebraska, Idaho, Oregon, and Alaska. And then, when it gets cold, they travel in flocks of up to 10,000 birds, south to states like Florida or New Mexico, some even stopping in northern Mexico. And to be honest, if I saw a flock of 10,000 almost 4-foot birds in the sky, I would have definitely thought it was an apocalypse, Let me know down below if you've ever seen this before. Now let's talk about vagrants. And not gonna lie, I got this mixed up with the variants at first, like from the MCU, to the point I had to look up if they were called the same thing, but they're not the same thing, except they kind of are. Vagrant birds are birds that get lost, essentially. It's thought that these birds are either unlucky, very young, or just inexperienced, or even faulty in some way. So these poor babies get lost from their flock and end up in places they do not normally inhabit. But if you want to be more whimsical like me, then you might be more inclined to side with those that spend their life studying the paranormal. Many professionals in the field of the paranormal, in the broad sense of the word, believe that the Mothman could be an alien, supernatural manifestation, or previously unknown species of animal. American writer Gray Barker made it one of his life missions to study and explore the notion of extraterrestrial beings and paranormal phenomenon. He wrote a book called The Silver Bridge in 1970 that linked the Mothman to the tragedy of the Silver Bridge collapse, which we will get into detail later. 5 years after this book came out, a man named John Keel would write the Mothman prophecies that popularized the Mothman even more. The Mothman prophecies also linked the Mothman to the collapse of the Silver Bridge, as well as other paranormal phenomenon. Then, director Mark Pellington believed the story had appeal for the masses, not just enthusiasts. So he turned the Mothman prophecies into a movie in 2002 starring Richard Gere and Laura Linney. And he was right because it helped spread the story of the Mothman throughout America and the world. Now, the collapse of the Silver Bridge, as we learned just now, is an integral part of the Mothman story. It further extends the legend of the Mothman from just alluring and enigmatic to a harbinger of death and destruction. On December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge above the Ohio River tragically collapsed. 31 vehicles fell into the water, 64 people would fall with these vehicles, 46 people would lose their lives, and 2 would never be found. The Silver Bridge was an I-bar chain suspension bridge built in 1928, which carried U.S. Route 35 over the Ohio River connecting Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Gallipolis, Ohio. When it comes to I-bars, prior to the Silver Bridge, these types of bridges often used 4 or more I-bars per link. Due to a higher strength steel, the links for the Silver Bridge only required 2. Each bar was 45 to 55 feet long and 2 inches thick, and were joined together at the eye holes using cylindrical pins 11.5 inches in diameter. The downside to this is that because there were only 2 eye bars per link, the failure of one of them would increase the loading on the other, making failure of a suspension chain and the collapse of the entire bridge far more likely. And this is sadly exactly what happened. Accident investigators found that, quote, had there been 3 or more eye bars per link, there would have been the possibility that failure of one bar would not have led to disaster. A single link had cracked about 0.1 inches or 2.5 millimeters deep that was too small for someone to catch during inspection. This crack grew and broke the link. When the lower side of the eye-bar failed, all the load was transferred to the other side of the eye-bar. The joint was then held together by only 3 eye-bars, and another slipped off the pin at the center of the bearing, so the chain was completely severed. This caused the collapse of the bridge to be inevitable. The reason why the Mothman is linked, no pun intended, to the Silver Bridge collapse was because there were sightings of the Mothman on the bridge prior to the disaster. But even if I thought the Mothman was real, which I do, I don't feel comfortable thinking this could be a possibility because people did unfortunately lose their lives during this tragedy. However, it will always be an integral part to the legend. It is speculated that a likely cause of people claiming to have seen the Mothman before the disaster and connecting the collapse to extraordinary circumstances is due to mass hysteria at the time. Mass hysteria is an outbreak of unusual and uncharacteristic behaviors, thoughts, and feelings or health symptoms shared among a group of people. One of the most well-known cases of mass hysteria is of the Salem witch trials of the early 1690s. Even before the collapse of the bridge, the spreading of the Mothman legend caused paranoia amongst the citizens of Point Pleasant. People wouldn't leave their houses, kids weren't allowed outside at recess, and people would give those that claimed to have encounters with the Mothman the side eye. But over time, the town of Point Pleasant began to heal from the initial shock and fear of the Mothman and began to embrace the Mothman. In 2002, the Mothman Festival began in Point Pleasant and still goes on to this day. It is held on the 3rd weekend every September and is estimated that 10 to 12,000 people come by every year, and Point Pleasant brings hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars a year after the festival. The town boasts an awesome 12-foot metallic statue created by Bob Roach and was unveiled in 2003. The festival hosts guest speakers, vendor exhibits, pancake eating contests, hayride tours of locally notable areas, and even a Mothman pageant. After the opening of the Mothman Festival in 2002, 3 years later in 2005, the Mothman Museum and Research Center had its grand opening. And I will one day be going to both of these. There was a stint of no Mothman sightings for many years. However, there are some recent sightings of the Mothman. There is an apparent photo that was taken by a man on a Sunday evening in November 2016 who was driving on State Route 2 that claims to have, quote, saw something jump from tree to tree, and this is when he got out of his car and took pictures. The man did decline an on-camera interview, but he swore he did not fake or edit the photos. He also claims to have just moved to Point Pleasant for work and has not heard of the Mothman legend before. Thanks to the spread of the Mothman legend worldwide, the legend still lives on to this day. It's up there in cultural significance and presence almost as much as Bigfoot. Almost. From clothing brands, plushies, merch to cosplays, the Mothman is likely never going to fully fade out of existence. At least I will personally try to participate in keeping the Mothman legend alive. Thanks to movies such as The Mothman Prophecies, Mothman continues to be immortalized in media. After its start in 2002, films were created such as Mothman in 2010 and Eyes of Mothman and also Mothman County in 2011. Video games are also a fun and engaging way to keep the legend of the Mothman alive. Some honorable mentions are Metroid Prime 2 Echoes for the Nintendo GameCube with a tribe of Mothman-like humanoid creatures called Luminoth. Then there's Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, where Mothman is one of the 3 cryptozoology-based monsters, along with the Yeti and the Flying Humanoid. And oddly enough, Mothman is possibly canon in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas and is said to be located in the desert. And of course, what we have all been waiting for, the infamous Fallout 76. Fallout 76 was released in 2018 by Bethesda. The people have been waiting, begging for a multiplayer Fallout. Bethesda attempted to bring the people what they wanted, but it did in fact fall out. Pun very much intended. People disliked that there weren't many NPCs to interact with, which is what gave Fallout its magic, especially in New Vegas. And there were also many bugs and technical issues in general. I did hear that this was also a problem for many others at first, but the leveling system of 76 was also wonky. I got 76 in 2018 and was so excited to play, but I went into a server and died within minutes every time because someone kept killing me right when I spawned, multiple times, and I haven't played it ever since. And yes, I am still very salty about it. But don't worry, I spent many of my waking and not working hours researching the Mothman lore of 76. Fallout 76 takes place 25 years after the Great War in 2102 in an alternate Fallout universe. You're a resident of Vault 76 in West Virginia that exits the vault on Reclamation Day in order to recolonize the wasteland. There's a lot more going on, but as a player you get to explore post-apocalyptic Appalachia, and along the way you discover many creepy cryptids wandering the area. One of those being Mothmen, and yes, plural. The legend of the Mothman in Fallout 76 is very on par to in real life. Mothman was popular before the Great War, being a half-man, half-moth that stalked the Point Pleasant area. It was also considered a harbinger of great danger due to his tendency to appear during deadly disasters in the area. Also, just like in real life, the Mothman became a very prevalent figure in the lives of cryptid hobbyists and conspiracy theorists who were obsessed with figuring out the enigma which is the Mothman. There is even a Mothman museum that becomes very significant to the lore of the Mothman in Appalachia. Mothman stories were sold as books and novelty holotapes, some even having Easter eggs of IRL aspects of the Mothman legend, such as the mentioning of Scarberry in holotapes. Not only was the Mothman intriguing to the masses, there were a group of people who took this obsession to the next level and started a cult that worshipped the Mothman. But before we get into them, let's talk about what the Mothman are. Even though the Mothman was an urban legend, it's thought that by cultists that it actually existed pre-war. However, what we do know is that the Mothman do in fact exist post the Great War. But not only is there one, but there are many variations with different eye colors and characteristics. There is the basic Mothman. They're more timid and will permanently vanish when approached or attacked, and all of these have little baby Mothmen called hatchlings. There is the stalking Mothman. These will follow any player near them. They don't seem to be aggressive, but they will defend themselves if attacked. And stalking Mothmen seem to only have red eyes. Then we've got the vengeful Mothmen that in themselves have different variations. There is a black variant that ranges between levels 20 to 50, the gray variant that ranges between levels 25 to 50, and the big dog red variant that ranges between levels 30 to 75. Most have orange eyes, but do occasionally have red eyes. They're, of course, as the name suggests, very aggressive and will be hostile. Then we have the glowing Mothman that glows due to prolonged exposure to radiation, just like glowing ghouls, and are mostly black with green features. And there's the scorched Mothmen that were infected by the scorched plague, and the scorched plague is a mutagenic infection that ravaged Appalachia between 2085 and 2103, wiping out nearly all human life in the region, except the dwellers of Vault 76. It was started by the Scorch Beast, which was once an ordinary bat that was grossly mutated by the machinations of the Appalachian Enclave's biochemical experiments around 2083. They are one of the rarest creatures in the game, but one may be found in the Enclave Research Facility. Finally, we have the Wise Mothman. The Wise Mothman has magenta eyes, is non-hostile, and appeared during the Mothman equinox. Now for the eyes, because they do tell a lot about the Mothman. There are the hatchlings. They have orange eyes and red veined wings. And even though the hatchlings have this characteristic for the most part, there are some adults that also have orange eyes with light gray wings that look like hatchlings. All orange-eyed Mothmen are hostile to vault dwellers, and they're not deemed spiritually significant, but followers will still kneel when they are visited. Next, we have the heavily irradiated green-eyed glowing Mothman. These are encountered in blast zones at night, which are heavily irradiated areas that were hit by nuclear missiles. Some are affected by the plague and have raw, mottled, and reddish skin. Then there are the red-eyed Mothmen that are very important to the Mothman lore. They are thought to have existed before the war and are also closely resembling the urban legend, with the legend being a half-man, half-moth with red eyes. They are considered holy by followers of the Winged One, and prophets of the Winged One wear red glowing goggles. And a faction of the cultists called the Enlightened believe that the followers were wrong for worshipping this Mothman and believe it to be a false idol. And then there is the elusive magenta-eyed Wise Mothman. The Enlightened believe it communicates with them through nonverbal means and grants them visions. It is the only variant that is not hostile to vault dwellers, and the followers dismiss the Wise Mothman as the purple liar and butterfly. Mothmen tend to like to perch in ruins or in the wilderness, watching over a specific area. Adult Mothmen tend to wander and live alone, except for worship sites and nesting grounds. When they're just chilling, they like to wrap their wings around themselves and look like a cloaked figure that is plotting your demise, but it's probably just really comfortable for them. They have cute little antennas and walk around with 4 undulating legs with a pair of forelegs held close to their face, and their wings fall back behind them. They don't bite, scratch, sting, or wrestle, but they defend themselves sonically by chittering intensely while hovering. But otherwise they make a subtle chirping noise. Due to a powdery neurotoxin on their wings, Mothmen are covered by a shadowy cloud around their bodies with small black specks that rise from their bodies and fade away. And when the Mothmen die, they drop this neurotoxin, and cultists use this neurotoxic dust during the Mothman equinox, and actually causes the player to hallucinate. Mothmen will lay their eggs in clusters across crevices that honestly really trigger my trypophobia. They prefer to nest among jagged roots overtaking pre-war structures and exclusively leave their eggs in the care of cultists, which seems fairly symbiotic. The Mothmen know their eggs are taken care of, and the cultists are probably geeking out over this. The eggs are soft and partially transparent with a red center, and they can be cooked into Mothman egg omelets, and thinking about eating omelets from the eggs of a giant insect is honestly nauseating. And in a blast zone, Mothman eggs mutate into ionized cockleberry, yielding raw crimson flux that can quench thirst and provide a boost to disease resistance. Cultists also extract a holy oil from what they called the Bright One's eggs for the anointment of ceremonial blades. With all of this talk about cultists and followers, who actually were these people? The lore of the Mothman cultists is very extensive, and I will put links to videos below that I love that go much deeper into the Mothman lore. But for now, let's talk about the cult's beginnings. Because of the obsession and interest of the Mothman and how sensational it was, there is a group of individuals that formed a cult in honor of the Mothman called the Cult of the Mothman. And they made a chapel beneath the Mothman Museum where they held secret rituals. On October 22nd, 2077, the Cult of the Mothman attempted to summon the Mothman, but instead, a man named Brother Charles was said to have received a vision from the Mothman that foretold an impending flood, and the cult was advised to find high ground. It is now believed that Charles's revelations were the whispers of the wise Mothman, and recount this omen as a warning of fire and flood. Because, as we now know, the fatal events of the Great War happened the very next day on October 23rd, 2077. The cultists survived the nuclear fallout by traveling to the Lucky Hole mine in a cliff overlooking Watauga. While the cult stayed safe in the Lucky Hole mine, the Charleston emergency government turned to the north, and many people were disturbed by frequent sightings of the Mothman. The creature at some point also being documented by the Appalachian Enclave. Not all of the cultists were created equal, however, because there is a sect called the Enlightened that exclusively revered the purple-eyed Mothman, whom they believed to be a unique, sentient, mortal creature from before the Great War. The Enlightened ended up leaving the Lucky Hole mine and left the state, which is how the Enlightened began. While they believe that the Wise Mothman saved them from death by granting Brother Charles, now known as Wise Charles the Forewarned, the insight to take shelter in the Lucky Hole mine, they did end up fleeing with Charles. Eventually, the remaining group, called the Followers of the Winged One, left the Lucky Hole mine and spread out in a series of crusades and established footholds in surrounding territories. Once they surfaced, they directly worshipped the red-eyed mutated Mothman as manifestations of the Holy Mothman. And I am sure that they were having a field day when they saw so many Mothmen roaming around Appalachia. However, in 2102, the cultists had all either fled or died. To regain a sense of community, in 2103, the Followers of the Winged One began to build new settlements within their old ones. At night, you can find these cultists communing with their beloved Mothmen and protecting their nests and even caring for their young. But in 2105, the cultists would abandon Ingram Mansion, a house that turned into a settlement by the cult of the Mothman, and large Mothman nests were cleared from the area. And you might be asking yourself this question I asked myself, and that is, do the Mothman even like the cultists? And from what I've researched, it seems like they really intertwine their lives with the cultists. They're often at the settlements that the cultists have cultivated, and most of the architecture of the cultist sites feature a specific place for Mothman to land at night. The followers offer handcuffed or caged human victims to the Holy Mothman, though there is no direct evidence that the Mothman even eat people. The Holy Mothman even accompany the followers in attacking the Equinox Festival. During the Equinox Festival, to summon the Wise Mothman, the Enlightened do an elaborate ritual. Because the Enlightened and the followers of the Winged One see each other as beneath one another, the Enlightened call the followers Dim Ones. The player is warned that the Dim Ones have been thrown into a fury after the dust of the Wise Mothman's neurotoxin is spread into the air. During the attack, it's a frenzy of cultists from both sides, the Mothman, and even Deathclaws thrown into the mix. There's no doubt about it that the cultists take the Mothman very seriously. After researching the Mothman in both real urban legend and Fallout 76, I wanted to compare and contrast because I love when cryptids are adapted into media. There are the obvious ones where they're both from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and in 76 pre-war folklore, they are both half-man, half-moth creatures with red eyes that attracted paranormal hobbyists and those with careers in the paranormal, and are both considered harbingers of death. There's even a Mothman museum and a Mothman statue, and basically the Mothman pre-war is almost an identical legend to the Mothman in real life. Except for an active Mothman cult, but I'm willing to bet about $3 there is a Mothman cult somewhere. The main differences come from the actual Mothman that show up post-war. For one, there are multiple Mothmen and multiple variations. They are also just giant mutated insects rather than a half-man, half-moth, causing them to look visually very different. It's very interesting to me that the Mothman itself was an actual folklore within the Fallout universe, but happened to be real in a way. It makes me wonder if the Mothmen were actually seen pre-war, or if it's a coincidence that moths happen to evolve into these giant Mothmen. Especially with the cult fully believing in the Mothman, even before the war. Maybe they saw something that they couldn't describe as anything other than utterly extraordinary. Overall, the legend of the Mothman is so beloved and intriguing to us that to this day we are still incorporating it into our media and our lives. The Mothman, despite being a creature of whimsy and curiosity, will also be tied to tragedy, paranoia, and death. The elusiveness of the Mothman will likely never be forgotten, and whether you believe in the legend or not, will never cease to dim the light it would assuredly follow. Comment if you never want the Mothman to go away, subscribe for more, and remember to keep your minds open and embrace the extraordinary.